So here we are at my official UFC 299 full card breakdown. Now, before we start, I want to give a disclaimer. Some of these fights I'm going to talk about a little more than others. It's just purely dependent on how much I personally care about it. So if I happen to not have much to say for a matchup you're really looking forward to, then I don't know what to tell you other than you have horrible taste in fights. Alright, starting off with the first fight of the night. Joanne Wood versus Maryna Moroz. Now, I mean, this is just one of those that... CJ Vergara versus Asu Almabayev. All you need to know for this matchup is you've got CJ, an American, versus Asu, who's from Kazakhstan. Bet the house on Asu. I promise. I promise. So, Robelis Despaigne versus Josh Parisian. Now, I want to say this in a respectful way. Josh Parisian is a lamb going out to slaughter in this fight. Let's just call it how it is. He is being put out there to get knocked out. And that's exactly what's going to happen. He's going to be at the wrong end of a massive height and reach disadvantage. So he's going to have a lot of distance he's going to need to try to cover in this fight. And he happens to be doing that against an Olympic bronze medalist in Taekwondo. I mean, this guy has a level of proficiency when it comes to landing head kicks that the heavyweight division has never seen. And also, he has a freakish amount of power with all of his limbs. His last 3 professional MMA fights have lasted a combined 15 seconds. Robelis' weakness is going to be strong wrestlers. Now, lucky for him, there's not a lot of them in the heavyweight division, and Josh certainly isn't one of them. I will be absolutely floored if this makes it past the first round. Flabbergasted. And now, Michel Pereira versus Michel. I'm not going to attempt that last name. Pereira, as many of you guys know, was that fighter known for just spamming all the buttons on his controller, doing these crazy backflips and kicking himself off the cage. And, you know, it was cool to see at first, but it ended up backfiring on him really bad in a lot of fights because he would gas out. But he's made a lot of adjustments to start really just sticking to the basics, which is what he needs to do. Obviously, there's moments to explode, but you don't need to always be exploding. I think this fight's pretty simple to break down. Either Pereira's going to win by decision or Michel is going to get the first round knockout. I do not trust Michel's ability to last all 3 rounds. And to me, I think the safest bet you can make is Pereira by decision. And now, Pedro Munhoz versus Kyler Phillips. Now, the first thing I want to say is that Kyler is very lucky he can grow such a nice beard, because if he did not have one, he would look, no exaggeration, 5 years old. But in my mind, that should be all towards his benefit, because I think he should be a pretty big favorite in this matchup. And I think there's 3 main reasons why. For one, obviously, he's going to have the height advantage and a really big reach advantage. 2 is his movement. He's always circling, sliding side to side, never a stationary target, and I love the way he throws the 1-2 right down the middle. It's real fast and fluid, no wind-up, and I think it's going to be a nightmare for Pedro trying to close that distance. Of course, he's going to be relying on the leg kick, but you already know Kyler and his team, they're working on that. If he comes into this fight ill-prepared for that, he needs to fire his entire team and start over. I don't foresee a ton of grappling going on in this fight, but Kyler, he's super well-rounded there as well. Good takedowns and great back takes. I just don't think Pedro has that many paths to victory. Oh yeah, and Pedro's 37. Now, Gamrot versus RDA. Now, you gotta respect the hell out of RDA for taking this fight. He had said himself that he no longer has title aspirations. Which makes sense. His fight with Fiziev was sort of his last run at 155, and then his fight with Vicente Luque was his last run at welterweight. So he really does not need to be taking on elite competition anymore, but here we are. When I think back to his prime, the thing that made RDA special was he was one of the very first guys to really be well-rounded. He had good striking, good wrestling, fantastic jiu-jitsu. And still, to this day, at 38 years old, he still is very well-rounded. But I think this is a super, super tough matchup for him. On the feet, Gamrot stays pretty defensively sound. It's not very easy to land clean shots on him. And his wrestling, it's just on another level. As far as pure wrestling goes, he is the best at 155. I do think he has some issues, though, imposing his grappling on a lot of guys, and that's just because he has trouble gaining respect with his striking. So a lot of times, guys are very ready for him to shoot. Though I do have one pretty big critique for Gamrot's grappling, and that is, once he gets you down, he really doesn't do very much damage, like, at all. Typically, he just grabs a hold of the body lock and tries to pin you, which does make it very difficult to get back to your feet, but most guys just scoot up to the fence and slowly work their way up. Now, of course, given the fact that the number one scoring criteria is damage, this can be problematic, and it's for that reason why I think Jalen Turner got robbed against him. I don't think it's a question. He did way more damage in multiple rounds. But where his wrestling really is a problem in all of his fights, but this matchup in particular, is one, he's got cardio for days. The takedowns are completely relentless. But what he's so good at is when he changes levels, it's how quick he cuts the angle. Whether he's grabbing the single leg and using a cross-body grip to spin you down, or just the traditional double leg. He gets to your legs fast, and he immediately gets to work off balancing you. And as soon as the scramble starts, he ramps up the pace even more. And he just will end up on top, no matter what, unless you're as good at wrestling as he is. It's just his ability to scramble. It is unparalleled in this division. So if you're not as good, which Rafael dos Anjos isn't, the only way to beat him is to avoid the wrestling, like Beneil Dariush did. Unfortunately for RDA, he's very takedown heavy in a lot of his fights. And on the feet, I don't see a reliable way he can finish the fight. Even if you do drop Gamrot, he just immediately shoots on you. He's very difficult to finish, and I'm pretty confident in saying this fight's gonna go to decision with Gamrot winning. And now, Curtis Blaydes versus Jailton Almeida. Now, this one was probably the hardest fight to break down out of all of them. And that is for the simple reason that both of these guys, in every single UFC fight they've had, they're always the ones hunting the takedown. Their opponents are always trying to avoid it. This will be the first time for both guys that they fought a strong wrestler. Now, on paper, you'd think Curtis Blaydes has the advantage here. And that's because, for one, he's going to have a 30-pound weight advantage. And two, way more comfortable striking. Blaydes has wins by KO, while Almeida, every second the fight is standing, he just looks uncomfortable. He looks bewildered, and he is immediately shooting. So here are the big questions. One, can Curtis stop the takedown? And two, how is he off of his back? And, as I notioned to earlier, that's what makes this so tough to call. I've never seen him have to defend the takedown before. The reason why Almeida is so effective at heavyweight, despite truly being a 205er, is how fast he is. Heavyweights, they're just simply not ready for how quickly he's able to drop down and get below their knees. If you're walking around 250 pounds, you're just not going to get that low. And I do not think Curtis Blaydes is going to be an exception here. I think Almeida is going to be way too fast. And that's just the trade-off you're going to have for being 30 pounds heavier. Unless Almeida keeps up his tradition of doing his teep to takedown attempt. If I'm Curtis, the second he teeps, I'm already ready to sprawl. But other than that, I don't think he'll be able to stop Almeida from getting deep on takedowns. But I want to point to Almeida's fight against Derek Lewis as a pretty interesting example. In the 5th round, where Lewis at this point was desperate to stay on his feet, Almeida was able to get pretty much as deep as physically possible on a takedown. He had Lewis's legs lassoed. And Derek, just using 100% size and strength, was able to keep himself up. Through multiple chains of takedowns Almeida was trying on him. Though it didn't last super long as Almeida tried the double again, got the legs lassoed again, and was able to finish the takedown. But still, that sequence did just enough to really make you wonder, okay, Blaydes, he has the same size advantage Lewis had, and on top of that, real wrestling skills. So, I do see Blaydes able to stop some takedowns. The problem is, though, if Almeida is able to get those legs laced, there's only so much you can do. And now, to answer the other question, how is Blaydes off his back? Well, he hasn't really been there in the UFC ever, but I was able to find some clips of him training at B-Team, and we got some pretty interesting insights. For one, he had some clips rolling with Nicky Rod where he showed really good defense while having his back taken. Nicky Rod was able to sink in a few rear naked chokes, but they did not come easy. And that's enough for me to say I really don't think Almeida's going to be able to find the submission. But there were some other clips of him doing some positional training off of his back, and he looked pretty lost. He was getting his guard pass to mount fairly easily, and as we know, Almeida has really good guard passing. So, in my mind, there are two possible outcomes for this fight. Either Curtis Blaydes is able to defend a couple takedowns and get the TKO finish at some point, or Almeida survives on the feet, he keeps shooting, he eventually gets his takedowns, wins by decision. And I'm leaning to that conclusion a lot more than the first one. Though I would be weary about adding this to the parlay just because we have to make a lot of assumptions about how this fight's gonna go. Petr Yan versus Song Yadong. I think for starters, there is no argument that Petr Yan is the best fighter in the UFC on a 3-fight losing streak. But I really do not think the 3-fight losing streak is representative of his skill set at all. Of course, there's the Aljamain Sterling fight, super close. The Sean O'Malley fight, super close. And then there's the Moroz fight, not so close. But as I've said before, Petr Yan's style is horrible for Moroz. Absolutely horrible. Petr Yan, for one, is very stationary. He does not utilize very much movement, which is great for someone hunting takedowns. You want a target that's going to stand still. When Moroz fought Henry Cejudo, we saw in round 1 how effective Cejudo's movement was at negating Moroz's takedowns. It wasn't until Henry fatigued hard and wasn't able to keep that movement up that he started to get ragdolled. And then there's Petr Yan's high guard style. He likes to keep up a tight guard, catch punches on his hands, and then throw counters. The problem against Moroz was just going punch, 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 takedown. Punch, 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 takedown. So because Petr Yan's hands were glued to his face, he wasn't able to get underhooks and therefore had to work really hard to defend the takedowns. But against Song Yadong, I think Peter's style is really going to shine. I just honestly really don't see many areas Song has an advantage. What makes him so good is his power. He absolutely has dynamite in his hands and good combinations. Unfortunately for him, though, he is fighting a guy who is insanely difficult to hit clean, but also absolutely nasty with his counters. Anytime you unload a combination on Petr Yan, he's just waiting to catch the punches on his hands and counter, and he's just so good at it. And a big weakness I see in Song's defense is his high guard. One thing Corey Sandhagen was having a lot of success with was flashing the 2 and then coming with a body kick. And because Song wouldn't have his elbows tucked, it would land flush right underneath. And as we know, Petr Yan loves flashing the hook and then throwing a same side kick to the body. And in this matchup, I think that's going to be all day for Yan. Though I will say, watching footage for this fight, I do see one area where I can see Song cracking him, and that is with the uppercut. The same one he was able to finish Marlon Moraes with. Now, typically Petr Yan, when he's covering up, does a good job at tucking his elbows in. But there are times I've noticed, specifically in the Jose Aldo fight, where Yan was moving in while covering up, and the uppercut was there. I would not be surprised if Song's team have picked up on this, and it's something they're looking for. Because with the amount of power Song has, he just needs to land one of them. But overall, I think it's pretty safe to say Petr Yan is going to be the far more skilled fighter in this matchup. So as I said, I see a possible opening that Song can exploit, but you gotta go with Petr Yan here. And now moving on to Gilbert Burns versus Jack Della Maddalena. Now this really pains me to say because I love Gilbert Burns. Absolutely love this guy. but I can really see him getting finished in this fight. Maddalena's boxing is so good. His punches aren't the most explosive, but he is so accurate and his timing is so good. When he lands a punch upstairs, it's right on the chin. When he rips to the body, right on the liver, and he folds people. He's also very good defensively. He covers up well, he parries jabs, and he has a really strong chin. In Jack's fight against Basil Havez, this guy, for one, was massive, super jacked, and he was landing these punches flush, and they were not these swinging haymakers as he was falling back. No, he was really sitting on these punches, putting his whole body behind it, and Jack was just eating them and returning. And now, Gilbert Burns has a ton of power, but he's never been known as a super technical striker. He's super dangerous. His overhands come really fast. Go ahead and ask Kamaru Usman and Khamzat how it feels to get hit by one. But I just think Jack's going to be on another planet when it comes to the boxing. Now, of course, Gilbert is going to have the massive advantage in the grappling. And I've heard a weird narrative going around for a while now that Gilbert Burns is pretty overrated because he doesn't get submissions despite being a jiu-jitsu world champion. And that's just kind of stupid because that's his style of jiu-jitsu, right? Gilbert Burns is a top player. And if you have your opponent pinned to the ground, there's not a ton of submissions you can go for that's not going to jeopardize your position on top. So, of course, in an MMA fight, as a top player, Gilbert's going to choose to stay on top and prioritize control over the submission. So where this fight's going to come down to is whether or not Gilbert Burns can get Jack down. Now, against the aforementioned Hafez, this guy, the one that's insanely jacked, he was super takedown heavy. And Jack was pretty much defending all the takedowns except for he kept jumping guillotine. And every time he grabbed it, Hafez would jump over to side control and Jack would get stuck there. And that is the only reason why that fight was a split decision. If it wasn't for those just tactical errors, Jack would have won handedly. But also, in the fight against Ramazev Imiev, this guy, high-level Dagestani wrestler, Jack showed really good takedown defense, was able to cause a scramble. He got back to his feet, but Imiev was able to get an anaconda choke on him, but it wasn't super tight. It wasn't under the neck. You see it kind of going across the face. So eventually he lets go, and Jack folds him with a body shot. Just overall, if Gilbert is able to time some really good takedowns and get Jack down, this is definitely a winnable fight for him, for sure. I just think the gap between them in terms of boxing skills, it's going to be too much. Gilbert lunging in with those big overhands, he's going to get picked apart. And Jack should be ultra worried about the takedown and just look to avoid the ground game at all cost. And if he's able to do that, I think he gets the finish. And now we move on to Michael Venom Page versus Kevin Holland. Now, typically, I'm not a big fan of MMA math, as, you know, it rarely ever works. But in this special instance, we've seen Kevin Holland deal with a style very similar to MVP. And that was his fight against Stephen Thompson. Now, both Thompson and MVP both utilized that sideways stance, and they utilized the blitz. And I think it's safe to say, Kevin Holland got absolutely eaten alive by Wonderboy's blitzes. We had seen in the past that if you pressure Wonderboy up against the fence, he's not as effective, because it forces him to square his stance. So that's what Holland was attempting to do. He wanted to pressure Wonderboy back, but he was having a lot of problems because what that sideways stance gives you is an ability to move forward and backwards extremely quickly. So Kevin would move forward, Wonderboy would shuffle back, then lunge in with a straight right, and then he's out again. And that was just all day for him. And unfortunately for Kevin Holland, I mean, that's MVP's specialty. And he has a lot more power than Stephen Thompson does. And Thompson has never been known for finishing guys with one punch. But MVP can. Against Douglas Lima, he was rocking him every time he landed that straight right. Also, against Thompson, Kevin Holland had the height and the reach advantage. That's no longer there in this matchup. But to be fair, I'm sure Holland and his team are rewatching that Stephen Thompson fight and trying to fix a lot of the errors they were making. And if I were them, my game plan would be to land the straight right as MVP blitzes in. But it's just so much easier said than done. Because as Kevin Holland told his coaches in between rounds against Thompson,
that old ass motherfucker's fast. Yeah, he's fast, okay?
That same issue is going to be here, but now you're dealing with a lot more power. So I feel very confident picking Michael Venom Page in this matchup. Now to the co-main event, Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. This is another really tough fight to call for the simple fact that Benoit is jumping from fighting number 14 all the way to number 3. So this is going to be the fight that shows whether he can hang with the top of the division. Based on what we've seen from him in the past, he's going to be very takedown heavy in this fight. On the feet, he gives openings to get countered. And of course, Dustin Poirier is not the kind of guy you want to do that to. But at the same time, Benoit is so insanely tough. You're going to have to kill him to finish this fight. He puts a tremendous amount of pressure on his opponents, tries to get them up against the fence so he can shoot. And once he takes you down, he's always hunting the submission. He's really good at passing the guard to mount and then just waiting for you to try to buck and explode and turtle so he can take your back, sink in the rear naked choke. If you choose to stay on your back and mount, he'll hunt for arm triangles or just ground and pound. And look, Dustin Poirier is very skilled on the ground, but he wouldn't be able to do to Thiago Moises that Benoit Saint-Denis was able to do. I don't think he's capable of that. And typically when Dustin gets put on his back, he chooses to stay there. And that's because in his fight with Khabib, he tried to be very offensive, got completely shut down, and he said himself afterwards he wished he just rode the round out and reset on the feet. So then the next time he fought a high-level submission artist in Charles Oliveira and he ended up on his back, he let the round go and just stayed there. And Saint-Denis, really good with submissions and really good guard passing. So Benoit is going to for sure be able to get Dustin backed up against the fence. The question is, how willing is he going to be to stand right in front of Dustin once he gets him there? Because typically, Saint-Denis just starts unloading. He gets guys to shell up because of his combinations, and then he shoots. But this strategy, while working very well in the past for him, he has gotten cracked with counters while doing this. And of course, you just unload recklessly against Dustin like Michael Chandler did, you're going to get cracked. So the only thing I know for sure in regards to this fight is do not add it to your parlay because there's just too many variables here we don't know yet. In my mind, either Dustin is able to find the counter, he's going to hurt Benoit, I don't think he can put him away, but he's going to be able to win the decision, or Saint-Denis takes him down, finds the submission. Though I would be lying if I didn't tell you, I am worried about all of Dustin's retirement talk. It's never a good sign when a fighter starts talking like this. This fight may truly be the end of an era. And now finally, last but not least, Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera. Now, obviously, just based on what we've seen from both of these guys in the past, Sean O'Malley is the far, far more skilled fighter. I mean, he just is. I'm weirdly seeing a lot of people say that Chito definitely hits harder, and I would just love to know what the fuck their reasoning is for that conclusion. In almost every single fight Sean O'Malley has had, he rocks his opponent. In almost every single one. If Chito Vera is finishing a fight, it's usually because he landed a Hail Mary head kick. And I'll be honest, I would love to see that happen in this fight. That would be crazy. But obviously, with the amount of distance I imagine Sean's going to attempt to keep between them, and with how high level Sean's movement is, I don't think that's very likely. As I spoke about in my full breakdown, certain prominent figures seem to think this fight is going to be insanely boring. They don't think Sean's going to engage at all. The words they use to describe what they think is going to happen in this fight is, and I quote, Adesanya versus Romero. And the problem with that comparison is, Israel Adesanya was never the strongest, he was never the fastest, he never hit quite as hard as his opponents. What gave him the edge was his technical kickboxing ability. But in this matchup, Sean is the heavy hitter. Sean is the knockout artist who finds people's chins. Now, I don't think he'll be able to find Chito's chin because of how well he covers up whenever his opponents move forward. But just like Rob Font was able to do against Chito, I'm sure Sean is going to find success with his jab. And once he starts landing the jab, he's going to let that right hand go, and I think he'll probably land. Chito is most likely going to be looking for the leg kick, and Sean should be very well prepared for it. And I think the safest bet you could possibly make for this fight would be Sean by decision. I really don't trust Chito's ability to finish this fight unless, of course, like I said, he lands some crazy Hail Mary shot. I mean, maybe if he catches him clean at some point before the third round, he can compromise him and squeak out a decision. I just don't think it's very likely. I think it's a far smarter bet to go for O'Malley here. And there you go. Bet the entire house on this insane parlay. I'm sure I'm going to get every single one right because it is MMA, the most linear, predictable sport in the world.